Welcome to our channel and happy listening.
There's a secluded lake hidden just a short walk from my home in Parsonsfield, Maine. It's a gem I cherish for as long as I can remember, a quiet oasis perfect for fishing in solitude. The lake lies tucked away from any roads or neighboring houses, enveloped in dense woods that guard it from the outside world. It's a place where I can escape and know I'll be the only one there. The silence broken only by the soft sounds of nature and the gentle splash of my line hitting the water. Every time I finish my fishing trips, I leave my kayak leaning against a massive old tree near the lake's edge. It's heavy enough that the wind can't knock it over, and I cover it to prevent any critters from making it a temporary shelter. This routine makes it easier than hauling the kayak back and forth from my house each time I want to enjoy the lake. On a warm summer evening, I was out there again, fishing under the fading sunlight. I'd already caught a few trout and was about ready to pack up, the remaining light slipping quietly behind the treetops, when I heard an unexpected sound. Turning towards the lake's edge, I saw a figure standing by the water, tipping a barrel and pouring its contents directly into the lake. At first, I thought my eyes were deceiving me, but as I looked closer, I realized the liquid spilling from the barrel looked dark, almost a thick red color. The sight sent a chill crawling up my spine. Polluting this pristine lake was bad enough, but something about the scene felt wrong. Instinctively, I shouted, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" The person froze, locking eyes with me for a moment before dropping the barrel and darting into the woods, the dark liquid still trailing into the lake. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I just witnessed. It was nearly too dark to be sure, but that liquid looked unsettlingly like blood. My heart pounded as a creeping sense of dread washed over me, urging me to leave as quickly as possible. I may love nature, but seeing someone defiling it like that is something I can't stomach. I knew I'd report this to the Department of Environmental Protection. Quickly, I paddled my kayak back to my usual spot and began unloading my gear. As I bent over to cover my kayak, I heard the unmistakable sound of a twig snapping close by, the kind of sound only a footstep would make. I stopped dead in my tracks, every instinct screaming at me to run. But instead of calling out, I decided to finish covering the kayak as fast as I could. I didn't even bother propping it up against the tree this time, leaving it lying on the ground. With my gear and cooler clutched in my hands, I hurried out of the woods and down the familiar path toward my house, casting nervous glances over my shoulder the whole way. The walk home took only a couple of minutes, but it felt like an eternity, each step weighed down by the feeling that someone was just behind me watching. As soon as I reached the shed, I stashed my gear hastily and darted inside, bolting the door shut. It was the quickest I'd ever locked it. After rinsing off the trout, I tucked them into the fridge, planning to cook them tomorrow. Tonight, leftovers would do just fine. While waiting for the microwave to finish, a sudden knock sounded at my front door, sending an icy chill down my spine. The uneasy feeling that had lingered on my walk back to the house roared back to life, as if confirming my worst fear. I hadn't come home alone. Someone was outside, watching me. With my car parked in the driveway and lights on, they knew I was inside. Another knock echoed through the room as the microwave beeped to signal that my food was ready. I winced, sure whoever was outside had heard it. My windows were cracked open, and then another knock, this time on the window, accompanied by a man's voice. "Excuse me," he called, the tone eerily calm. "I think you saw me at the lake earlier. I'd like to explain myself." Every instinct screamed not to engage. The fact that he tracked me to my home painted him as dangerous, and I had no intention of opening the door. As his knocking grew more insistent and his voice more forceful, I finally responded, my voice carrying an edge of controlled fear. "Get off my property, or I'm calling the police." I intended to make the call anyway, but the threat was necessary to get him gone. For a moment, silence settled outside. Then, his voice returned, now softer and placating. "I'm sorry," he murmured through the window. "If you just open the door, I'll explain everything." Another cold wave of fear surged through me. Refusing to let my guard down, I yelled back, "Leave, or I'm calling the cops." At last, his voice faded, and I heard nothing more. Moving swiftly, I went from window to window, locking each one shut and switching on the AC to drown out any lingering noises. After filing a report with the non-emergency police line, detailing both the strange encounter by the lake and the man's unwelcome appearance at my house, I also submitted an online report to the Department of Environmental Protection about the incident at the lake. Those reports granted a small sense of relief, enough to let me climb into bed, hoping sleep would come easily. Around 2 a.m., however, a loud crash jolted me awake. My heart hammered as I sprang from the bed, instinctively grabbing my Glock from the closet. I stood in the darkness, straining to listen as quiet, hesitant footsteps crept up my wooden staircase, the boards giving their betraying creak with each careful step. Moving silently, I took position behind my dresser by the closet, gun in hand, aimed directly at the door. The footsteps approached slowly, each one amplifying my fear and adrenaline. My bedroom door was the first along the hall, and sure enough, I heard the doorknob twist, slowly at first, before the door inched open. In the dim light, a silhouette appeared. A man. He entered cautiously, likely unaware of my presence. In an instant, I flicked on the lamp beside me, flooding the room with light, and raised my voice with authority. "On the ground now," I barked, the Glock steady in my grip. He froze, hands raised in a motion of surrender, yet he held a small blade in his right hand. His gaze was unsettlingly calm as he looked at me, as if trying to ease my alarm. "Drop it," I ordered, eyes fixed on him. His reply was disturbingly collected as he murmured, "I'm leaving." Then, without another word, he turned and bolted toward the stairs. I shouted for him to stop, but he vanished down the hall, taking his chances. The eerie calmness in his voice replayed in my mind, leaving me both shaken and alarmed. Paralyzed with fear, I couldn't bring myself to pull the trigger. I heard the man's hurried steps retreat through the front door. Heart pounding, I sprinted downstairs and locked the door behind him before frantically dialing 911. My living room window was shattered, shards of glass strewn across the floor, glinting under the dim light. I kept my eyes trained on that broken window, half expecting him to return until finally, red and blue lights flashed outside, signaling the arrival of the police. I explained to the officers that I'd already filed a non-emergency report earlier, fearing that the evidence, the barrel, might vanish if left unaddressed until morning. 2 officers accompanied me back to the lake, retracing my steps to where I'd seen the man dumping the contents into the water. But after a tense 20 minutes of scouring the area, we found nothing. The barrel was gone. He must have come back to retrieve it, erasing any trace of whatever he was hiding. When the officers asked for a description, I did my best to recall his appearance. A short, bearded white man with a receding hairline and glasses, wearing a black flannel shirt and dark pants. They jotted down my account for the report before departing, leaving me alone in a house with a shattered window and a feeling of vulnerability that seeped into my bones. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, my Glock close by, mindlessly watching TV. There was no way I'd fall asleep, not with that madman out there and broken glass on the floor. At dawn, my brother Dale came over to help board up the window. We decided it'd be best if someone stayed with me, so Dale kept me company at the house while our other brother and I headed to Home Depot to pick up a new window and supplies. Dale stayed with me for a few nights until the tension simmered down. Even now, my gut screams that what I witnessed wasn't just casual littering. I can't shake the thought that the barrel might have held something sinister, perhaps human remains dissolved in chemicals, explaining why he'd be so desperate to confront me and even break into my home. Some instincts can't be ignored. Mine were practically screaming. If I'd opened my door to that stranger, I might not be here to tell this story. Ever since I was a kid, fishing was a family tradition, almost a rite of passage. The older men in the family, my dad, uncles, and even distant relatives, would take me out to fish at every chance. I was the youngest, and they always joked that I was next in line to become the family's fishing expert. Among the avid anglers in the family, my dad and his brother Matthew were the most serious. Our house practically looked like a fisherman's den, the kind you'd see on a fishing show. You'd know just by stepping inside that my parents probably spent more time on the water than on solid ground. But this isn't just my story. It's actually my dad's. His name is John, and while he's tough as nails, This experience rattles him. Every time he tells it, a shadow crosses his face, like he's reliving every moment. Although he rarely brings it up, every once in a while at family gatherings, someone coaxes the tale out of him. This story involves him, my Uncle Matthew, and three of their close friends, Rich, Jeff, and Monty. They'd set out early one morning before the sun even hinted at rising, aiming for a secluded fishing spot they all swore was perfect. It was an untouched area, a couple of hours by boat from the nearest marina, a hidden cove most didn't bother to explore. They loved it for its solitude and the rich catch waiting below the surface, known only to those who ventured far beyond the typical fishing grounds. As the boat sliced through the mist rising off the lake, my dad and his friends settled into the day, sharing jokes over the hum of the engine. They anchored in a quiet cove surrounded by dense forest, a familiar spot known for occasional pike and endless bass. The morning began with Monty, the group's wild card, cracking open a beer before the sun was fully up, a habit my dad often brings up when he retells this story. Monty always drank a bit more than the others, and it didn't take long before the sound of clinking beer cans became a familiar backdrop. For hours, they cast their lines, the water's calm only interrupted by the occasional splash of a lure or a shared laugh echoing over the cove. Each catch spurred a small celebration, a tradition for the group. But as the day turned to dusk, a thick, eerie fog started rolling across the lake, creeping up and swallowing their boat in a thick white veil. My dad always emphasizes how unsettling it felt, like the world was closing in on them. Rich, the most experienced fisherman of the bunch, remarked he'd never seen fog this dense, not even on early morning fishing trips. Yet, despite the unsettling atmosphere, Monty and Jeff, the jokesters of the group, kept drinking, laughing off the unease the fog brought with it. As night fell, they figured the fog would eventually lift, but it showed no signs of thinning. With the fading light, my dad and Rich thought it best for Matthew to try steering the boat out of the cove and into open water, where they hoped the fog wouldn't be as heavy. But despite being the most cautious of them all, Matthew struggled, narrowly missing the shore in his attempt to navigate. The dense fog had turned even simple maneuvers into risks, and they all agreed it was too dangerous to continue. Resigned to spend the night on the boat, my dad suggested they should at least call home to let their families know. But of course, there was no signal out in this remote cove. Dad couldn't afford to be out of touch due to some work obligations, so he decided to head ashore to find a signal. Rich and Jeff offered to join him, leaving Matthew to guard the boat and keep an eye on Monty, who was well past tipsy. Grabbing the emergency flares from the boat in case they got lost, the three of them stepped into the pitch-black forest, their way lit only by the dim glow of their phone flashlights. They weren't exactly strangers to camping, so the forest itself wasn't the problem, but the visibility or lack thereof gave the place an almost supernatural vibe. It was dark as midnight, and the fog hung heavily in the trees, dampening every sound, every step. As they pushed deeper into the woods, the silence felt unnaturally thick, every breath adding to the eerie atmosphere. Suddenly, a strange, rhythmic clicking sound sliced through the silence, emanating from somewhere directly in front of them. They froze, instincts honed from years of camping warning them to be cautious. The sound repeated, echoing faintly, and then seemed to multiply, encircling them. Whatever was making that noise, it wasn't just one thing. My dad held his breath, listening, his heart pounding. The clicks echoed around them, their rhythm unsettling, like a hidden code. The men exchanged glances, each trying to read the other's expression. Rich whispered that they should stay alert and keep moving uphill, but the sounds were closing in, now from every direction, as if whatever was out there didn't want them leaving the forest. The sounds in the forest were unlike anything my dad and his friends had heard before. They were rhythmic yet erratic, as if someone or something was tapping out a secret code. And then it hit them like a punch to the gut. The sounds were human-made. The thought that they weren't alone in the woods was paralyzing. Rich, who had the most outdoor experience, motioned for them to turn off their flashlights, whispering, "Don't give away our position." With the flashlights off, the darkness felt oppressive, pressing in from every side. The clicking noises stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence that seemed to wrap around them like a shroud. Time felt distorted as they stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Each of them was likely thinking the same thing. Had they stumbled upon some kind of forbidden gathering in these woods? But before they could form a plan, the silence was shattered by rustling noises, this time much closer. And then a scream, a primal, piercing wail that echoed through the trees, freezing them in place. It was a girl's scream, raw with anguish, and it jolted them back to reality. Reacting on pure survival instinct, the three men turned and bolted, sprinting back the way they had come. My dad, acting on impulse, raised the flare gun and fired behind them. The flare shot through the fog, casting an eerie red glow that briefly illuminated the woods. And in that split second, they saw them. A group, more than a dozen figures, stood clustered in the shadows, barely visible in the flare's crimson light. They wore what could only be described as tribal attire, some holding wooden spears, others with strange, painted faces. The sight was beyond terrifying, searing itself into my dad's memory. Jeff let out a scream, stumbling as panic overtook him, but Rich grabbed his arm, pulling him forward as they continued to flee. My dad says he had never felt fear like that in his life, a raw terror that made every nerve in his body scream. The forest seemed to work against them, with branches snagging their clothes and roots catching their feet, as if it too wanted to keep them trapped. Finally, they broke through the tree line, panting and disoriented but alive. They reached the boat and screamed at Matthew to start the engine, their voices laced with an urgency that left no room for questions. Matthew, sensing their fear, immediately revved the engine, and the boat lurched forward just as their pursuers reached the shoreline. In the chaos, my dad fired the last flare toward the shore. For a split second, they could see at least 15 figures standing there, motionless, their faces blank and haunting as they watched the boat speed away. Then the flare's light faded, and darkness swallowed the scene once more. Once they were a safe distance away, Matthew cut the engine. The only sounds were the labored breaths of my dad, Jeff, and Rich, still trying to process what had just happened. My dad said he barely had time to process what had happened that night until nearly an hour after it was all over. He'd been running on pure adrenaline and survival instinct, feeling the fear only after the danger had passed. That night, they took turns keeping watch, one eye open for anything unusual, and left the cove first thing in the morning as soon as the fog finally lifted. Interestingly, Monty, who had passed out before everything went down, didn't remember a single detail of the night and laughed off their nerves the next day. Even now, telling the story makes my skin crawl, and I can only imagine what my dad must feel each time he recalls it. I've been fishing since I was a kid, and now, as I near 60, it's become more than a pastime. It's a way of life. My children are grown, off living their own lives, leaving the house quieter than it's ever been. Sometimes the silence feels heady. I miss the days of tossing a football with my boys in the backyard, but those days are memories now. Nowadays, I often fish alone. My college buddies join me sometimes, but most of the time I'm out there by myself, like a lone wolf. It was mid-April, early in the season, just after the ice out but before May, and for some reason, I wanted a more secluded spot this time. So I picked a remote lake, small and hidden, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. I drove up just before sunrise, hoping to be on the water when the first light broke through. After unstrapping my kayak from the roof, I paddled out to the middle of the lake, soaking in the colors that were slowly filling the sky. The serenity of the lake felt like home, and I wouldn't have traded that morning for anything. Despite the chill, I felt as sturdy as the steel of my rod. As the sun began to rise, I made my way to the edge of the weed beds, hoping for largemouth bass. My rod was a 6.5-foot medium action with 9-pound monofilament line. I went with my usual setup, a 4-inch rubber stickworm rigged wacky style, my trusted lure for bass. Just as I cast my line, something unusual caught my eye across the lake. I could barely make it out, but there was definitely movement. At first, I assumed it was another fisherman. Curiosity got the best of me, so I reached into my bag for my birdwatching binoculars. Focusing across the lake, I spotted 3 figures standing along the shore, each dressed in dark, hooded robes. Under the cover of darkness and with their faces hidden beneath hoods, these strangers were up to something strange on the edge of the lake. They appeared to be digging, though I couldn't tell for what purpose. I watched closely, thinking they'd bury something. Instead, they did the opposite. One of them reached into the hole and pulled something out, though from my distance, it was impossible to tell exactly what. The other two followed, each lifting items from the earth, which they then began throwing into the lake, one by one, each splash echoing across the water. I was struck by a sudden sense of dread. Something felt incredibly wrong. A rush of fear swept over me. I had no clue who these people were, but every instinct screamed that they were dangerous. Thankfully, after tossing in the last of their mysterious items, they turned and headed back into the woods, never noticing me. For a moment, I considered just ignoring what I'd seen, but my curiosity wouldn't let me. I waited, holding my breath until they vanished into the trees, and then slowly paddled my kayak over to where they'd been. My hands were trembling as I reached the spot, but this time I wasn't fishing for bass. I was looking for whatever they had tossed in. I fished around for a while but found nothing. Just as I was about to give up, I remembered my depth tracker. Determined, I paddled back to shore, grabbed it from my car, and returned to the area, sweat trickling down my neck as I resumed my search. With the depth tracker, I poked around the lake bed, feeling only soft mud at first. But then my tracker hit something solid, a distinct metallic clink. I mentally marked the spot, removed my fishing rig, and attached the largest hook I had, letting the line drop gently into the water. Years of fishing experience guided my fingers as I moved the line carefully, hoping to snag whatever was lurking beneath the surface. After a few tense minutes, the line suddenly tugged harder than expected. I'd hooked onto something. Slowly, I reeled it in, my heart pounding as I glimpsed my catch emerging from the water. A black 9mm pistol, its barrel gleaming under the morning light. I could hardly breathe. My skin prickled as I realized that those strangers had thrown the gun into the lake. I didn't dare look for the other items. Carefully, without touching the gun, I secured it in the kayak and paddled to shore as quickly as I could. The moment I reached land, I called the police. They arrived shortly after, launching a full investigation and dredging the area. Watching the search, I couldn't shake the urge to know what else might lie beneath the surface. The divers soon surfaced with more unsettling finds. A heavy keychain with several keys and various other grim relics of unknown origin. The police recovered an assortment of eerie items, including a locket wrapped in cloth that had clearly suffered water damage, rendering the photos inside faded and unrecognizable. They assured me they'd reach out if they connected the dots to any crime, but the call never came. Strangely, that wasn't the end of my experience. A few nights later, I heard voices in my front yard, someone saying, "That was the car, I know it." A group of people was creeping around my property. They didn't knock or ring the bell, but seemed to circle my house before eventually leaving. I had no idea if they were the same individuals from the lake incident, nor did I know if I was being watched every time I stepped outside. I contacted the police again, hoping to reopen the investigation, but nothing came of it. I was left with so many questions. Why had those items been buried in the first place? What compelled those individuals to return and dig them up only to hide them again? Perhaps they realized there was a greater chance of being discovered if those items remained underground, so they opted to toss them into the lake instead. Or maybe the contents of that hole had lain there for years before they decided to unearth them for some unknown reason. Overall, it was the strangest experience I had ever encountered while fishing. Throughout my life, I often shifted between hobbies, immersing myself in one interest for a year or so before moving on to the next. In the summer of 2022, my focus turned to fishing. My family owned a shore house about an hour's drive away, situated by the water with a lagoon and a small Boston whaler. My friends and I frequently visited to fish and relax. The following October, after the summer rush, my friends Kevin and Arian planned a weekend at the shore house to try their luck catching stripers, which were plentiful in the fall. Kevin, an avid fisherman, was a significant influence on my own fishing obsession. Unfortunately, our boat was out of commission for maintenance, which meant we had to fish from the beach and piers. Luckily, Kevin had all the necessary rods and gear. We met up on a Friday afternoon, and I drove us to the shore house. Once there, we spent the day fishing from various piers along the inlet. Night fell, and only Kevin managed to reel in a catch. a small bass that didn't bring much excitement. Disappointed by our lack of luck, we decided to stay up late and fish off the beach. Kevin mentioned a good spot about 15 minutes away, leading us down a desolate road flanked by woods. Eventually, we arrived at a small gravel parking area, or at least it appeared to be one. Kevin suggested that since we'd need to walk a bit to the fishing spot, we should. We made sure to pack everything we would need so that we wouldn't have to trek back to the car for supplies. Our plan was to stay up until sunrise, so we loaded up accordingly. After about a 5-minute walk down the path, we emerged onto a vast beach where we set up our camp, complete with beach chairs, a speaker, and 2 coolers, one filled with ice for our catch, and the other stocked with snacks, water, and beers. Kevin had brought along some hefty fishing rods that were perfect for beach fishing, as well as rod holders that we could hammer into the sand. He also had these small bells that attached to the tips of the rods to alert us of any movement. We cracked open a couple of beers and settled into the waiting game. Within 2 hours, each of us had reeled in a decent-sized fish, which boosted our spirits and made for a great time with music blasting in the background on that deserted beach. In the midst of our conversation, Arian suddenly stopped speaking, lowered the music, and jerked his head to the left. He asked if we had heard something, and when we replied we hadn't, he seemed to concentrate for a moment before saying he thought he heard someone yell. We'd assumed he was either joking or imagining things, but he insisted it had sounded like a yo or a hey. Given that we were on a secluded beach at 1:00 a.m., it seemed unlikely, so we quickly dismissed it and continued our conversation. Nonetheless, it did make us more alert. A few minutes later, right after I cast out a fresh hook, I noticed something moving at the edge of my vision. It was hard to make out from a distance, but the others spotted it too. As it got closer, we realized it was a person walking toward us. We fell silent and switched off the music. When he approached, we saw that he was a middle-aged white man, likely in his 40s or 50s. He wore a dark blue jacket with his hat pulled down and a hood up. His manner of walking seemed suspicious, and he had an intimidating look on his face. We awkwardly greeted him, and he stared at us for a good 10 seconds before asking in a low voice, "What are you boys up to?" It was clear what we were doing, and Kevin replied, "We're fishing." The man grunted in acknowledgement and nodded, but then he fell silent, just standing there, looking at us, the rods, and then the water. We exchanged glances, suspecting he might be up to no good. There was no way he could take on all 3 of us, but still, it felt tense. Just then, the bell on one of our rods rang, breaking the silence and signaling that we might have hoped to fish. "We got one," I said, directing my comment mostly at the strange guy, hoping for a normal reaction from him. I walked over to the rods and reeled in a small striper. When I returned to unhook the fish, I noticed that the man had turned around and left. We watched as his dark silhouette faded into the distance. After a long and unsettling night, we made sure to gather all our belongings and sat down to discuss how strange our encounter had been. Thankfully, the man had left without causing us any harm, and we concluded he was just a peculiar character who was now out of our lives. To stay cautious, we kept the music off and cracked open a few more beers as our conversation shifted to various topics. While gazing at the horizon, I suddenly thought I heard something in the distance. It took me a moment to recognize the sound, but when I did, my heart sank. It was the unmistakable blare of a car alarm. I immediately realized it was my car. It was the only one in that lot, and there weren't any houses for miles. Panic set in, and we decided to dash back to the car, leaving all our equipment behind. It took us a couple of frantic minutes to reach the vehicle, and when we arrived, I was devastated to find that my tires had been slashed and my driver's side window was shattered. I immediately called the police, explaining my location and the situation. The operator asked if I knew who might have done it, and I mentioned the sketchy guy who had approached us while we were fishing. Just as I finished speaking, I heard rustling in the woods nearby, and my heart raced. I felt utterly trapped. We frantically sprinted about 200 yards down the road and hid among the trees. I relayed this to the operator, who advised us to stay hidden and quiet. Within 10 minutes, we saw 2 police cars zoom past with their lights flashing. We cautiously made our way back to my car, where we found 3 officers searching the area. Several items have been stolen, including my wallet, some cash from the glove box, and the rest of Kevin's fishing gear. They discovered a large knife lying on the ground nearby, which they took for fingerprints and evidence. With adrenaline still coursing through me, I recounted the entire story to the officers. They remarked that we had made the right decision to run away and hide, as it was very likely that the man meant us harm. Hearing those words made me truly appreciate my life in that moment. The officers were kind and helped us pack up our equipment before taking down our information and giving us a ride back to the house. We spent the rest of the night reflecting on the ordeal. The following morning, Arian arranged a ride for us up north, and a few days later, I retrieved my car from the shop. To this day, that experience remains the most frightening thing I have ever encountered. What was meant to be a simple fishing trip turned into a terrifying ordeal that cost me hundreds of dollars in damages. I never received a call back from the police, and the thought that the guy might still be out there haunted me. Unsurprisingly, I gave up fishing as a hobby and haven't touched a rod since.